Hi, in this lecture, we're going to talk more about bone formation and growth and remodeling. So when we're looking at bone development, bone develops in two different ways. And we talk about bone development, we also talk about something called ossification, which means forming bone. However, both of these processes use something called calcification. And calcification is just the process of depositing calcium salts into a tissue. It can happen to any tissue in your body, but we specifically look at it when we form bone because the matrix of bone must harden or calcify when we put those calcium salts in it. Keep in mind, like I said, any other tissue this can happen in. Unfortunately, it can happen in our blood vessels. You can have hardening of your arteries, which is called arteriosclerosis, and other areas of your body can actually undergo calcification. When we look at ossification, though, there's two ways of forming bone. So ossification means forming bone. Number one is intramembranous, and number two is endochondral. Now, most bones use endochondral ossification. Your textbook goes into a lot of details for this, but I'm going to give you an overview of the processes. So two ways to make bone. The intramembranous process is going to start with mesenchyme cells. Remember, mesenchyme cells are stem cells, and they are found in connective tissue. In fact, a lot of these come from the dermis layer of the skin, which is why these bones are sometimes called dermal bones when they're formed. But what's going to form are the flat bones, and primarily the flat bones of the skull. So in this case, the stem cells differentiate and become osteoblasts, and they make bone. Whereas endochondral, if you look at the word, you see endo meaning within and chond meaning cartilage. So this is very different in that you are born with cartilage. In fact, you have a hyaline cartilage skeleton as a fetus and a newborn and childhood, and that cartilage skeleton is slowly replaced by bone. So you have cartilage first, and then bone replaces cartilage. Well, this takes a lot longer for this to occur. In fact, the longest bone to ossify is actually the xiphoid process off of your sternum. They say that could actually not completely ossify or become bone until your 40s. So we look at these processes intramembranous within the membranes. Basically what happens is those stem cells, those mesenchyme cells, differentiate. They turn into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts make bone, and this will form most of the flat bones of your skull. If we look at endochondral, again, within cartilage, it's a little bit different. So remember that your hyaline skeletal model, so you have actually I should say hyaline cartilage model, is surrounded by, so each hyaline cartilage model is surrounded by the perichondrium. Remember, the perichondrium surrounds cartilage. The periosteum surrounds bone, and that's dense, irregular connective tissue. You might remember that this was pretty important because was cartilage vascular or avascular? And hopefully you said avascular. So what happens is you have a hyaline cartilage model, and the perichondrium is going to have chondrocytes. Well, in that perichondrium, those chondrocytes and chondroblasts are going to turn into osteoblasts. And this is around the outside of the cartilage. Now, once you get osteoblasts start to make bone. Well, bone calcifies. It's very hard. So nutrients cannot diffuse through that. And what's going to happen is those cartilage cells are going to die. So the chondrocytes are going to die and disintegrate and degenerate. And then they leave their little space behind. They're going to leave that lacuna behind. And then what happens is bone will grow into the lacuna. Osteoblasts replace chondrocytes. They enter the lacuna and they make bone. Blood vessels grow into the area, and eventually you start to make your bone. So I'd like you to know the primary differences, and we're not going through any more detail than that. But notice when you make bone, when the hyaline cartilage is replaced, there's a couple places that you have hyaline cartilage left. It remains. And this little area here, and this area here is where the epiphyseal plate is. We talked about that in the previous lecture. So some hyaline cartilage remains in the epiphyseal plate, and some hyaline cartilage remains on the end of bone. So in endochondral, most of the cartilage is replaced by bone, except for those two areas. Now, the epiphyseal plate, right? This is a layer of cartilage, and this is cartilage that can undergo mitosis because this is critical for bones to grow longer. So how do bones grow longer? Well, what happens is there's this area of cartilage, again, this epiphyseal plate, hyaline cartilage. We're not memorizing the zones, but what you see is hyaline cartilage, and then you see bone on one side. So what happens is the bone grows into the cartilage and it starts to replace cartilage with bone. However, the cartilage migrates, it undergoes mitosis, and it keeps moving away. So the cartilage is why bone grows longer, because as long as those cartilage cells keep replicating, bone can't catch up, and so bone keeps chasing it, cartilage keeps moving away, and this happens on both ends of bone, both epiphyses, and so the bone gets longer. So the bone gets longer because of the cartilage, not the bone. Now eventually the bone catches up, and when the bone catches up and wipes out all this cartilage, now you can't grow anymore, and you have what's called the epiphyseal line. In this picture, you can see what happens in a growing bone. You can actually see this growth plate here, right? Nice thick. And then look what happens once you've reached adulthood, and basically once bone catches up and catches cartilage. And you can see this on an x-ray. You can see a child's x-ray, and you can see these little, they look like little gaps or spaces because that's the cartilage, and cartilage is less dense than bone, so it won't look as dense on an x-ray. And you can compare that with the adult hand. Now, how do bones get thicker and wider? That's called appositional growth, and it's pretty straightforward. You basically have your endosteum and then you have your periosteum on the outside, but the endosteum has a layer of osteoblasts. So we're looking at the osteoblasts that are basically in the entire inner circle, right? The circumference around the bone, and the osteoblasts just keep laying down more bone, and they start to move out and get thicker and thicker. And what happens is this little layer inside of it, it starts to hollow out. See how the space is getting bigger for that medullary cavity because there's osteoclasts, and they come right behind it and they kind of eat away while the osteoblasts are going to make it wider. So the appositional growth, or getting wider and thicker, is due to bone, is due to osteoblasts. Now, when we look at hormones, there's several hormones that affect our bones, and we're going to have a whole unit on hormones later, but you need to learn these for now. So growth hormone, we usually just abbreviate GH. I would like you to know that growth hormone comes from an endocrine organ called the anterior pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland, I know you've heard of, but the pituitary gland has an anterior and a posterior. So growth hormone comes from the anterior. And just what it sounds like, it stimulates growth. It actually causes this thing IGF, which is called insulin-like growth factor. And this is a pretty important growth factor. It actually stimulates bone and muscle and cartilage growth. So that hormone is very important. Thyroid hormone is sometimes called T4, or we call it, you'll see it called thyroxine. Comes from the thyroid gland, and it also stimulates bone growth and helps stimulate osteoblasts. Now, you've probably heard of thyroid hormone controlling your metabolism, but it also helps your bones grow. So if a child is deficient in growth hormone or thyroid hormone, they'll have a shorter stature. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are two really important hormones, and they primarily focus on calcium deposition, and they help control the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. Now, calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland, and you probably know the thyroid gland is in your neck, and calcitonin is going to basically stimulate bone deposition. So it's going to stimulate the osteoblasts. Whereas parathyroid hormone, we just say PTH, comes from the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are on the back, on the posterior side of the thyroid. That's an opposite. It has an opposite effect. So when we look at hormones and they have opposite effects, we say they're antagonists. So PTH does the opposite. It's going to stimulate your osteoclasts, and it's going to break down bone and release calcium. And we'll have more on that later. Your sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, these are primarily released at puberty. And you probably know at puberty you grow. So they really help stimulate the osteoblasts. And then they reach certain levels where they are actually the hormones that close the epiphyseal plate and turn it into the line. Now, estrogen tends to affect it sooner than testosterone, which is why in females, that epiphyseal plate typically becomes the line around age 18. But in males, testosterone allows it to go a little bit longer. It's usually around 21 that males stop growing. Now, I mentioned you could have abnormalities in growth hormone. So this is a normal size female, probably like 5'3". And in this case, we have someone with too much growth hormone, and that's called gigantism. So what happens is if you have too much growth hormone, like possibly a pituitary tumor, then too much is produced and you just keep growing and growing, and you could be 7 feet tall. Now, if you have too little growth hormone, you could have a type of dwarfism, and there's different types of dwarfism that can occur. But if there was an issue with the growth hormone from the pituitary gland, you're going to have normal proportions but be very, very small. And this is why they do those height and weight charts on children to make sure that they're growing properly. Now, another group of hormones that affect our bones, but this is a group of hormones that basically decrease bone strength. Okay, so they basically increase bone loss, and these are your glucocorticoids, and cortisol is an example of that. And you might know that cortisol comes from the adrenal cortex. So you saw the adrenal, or you can call it suprarenal glands, but the adrenal cortex makes cortisol. Cortisol is a precursor for prednisone, cortisone, and you don't want to be on these medications for a long time because they do increase bone loss and break down bone. So bone's very dynamic. You know, we look at bones in lab and have these dried out things, but bone is moist, it's alive, it's tissue that responds to stress, and our skeleton is constantly remodeled. So remodeling is basically you break it down and build new bones. So you're constantly breaking down the old bone and replacing it with new, fresh bone. So this primarily involves our osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The osteocytes usually just kind of maintain our bone density, but the blasts are the ones that are actually making new matrix and doing bone deposition, where the clasts are actively breaking it down. So if you're building bone faster than you're breaking it down, then you're building big, stronger bones. However, if you're breaking it down faster than you're building it, now your bones are getting weaker. So what causes this to happen? Well, we know that stress is good. Any kind of stress, mechanical stress, pulling, pushing force on your bones actually increases osteoblast activity. They know that there's actually these crystals in there that generate a little electrical field, and that brings osteoblasts to the injury or even the area. We'll talk more about this in healing of bone, but it will bring osteoblasts and help make your bones thicker and stronger. So the osteoid, remember, is what's produced. That's a lot of that matrix, that collagen matrix, and then it becomes calcified when the calcium is deposited in it. So the two main types of stress that we put on our bones are functional and gravitational. So remember that muscles insert on bones, usually through a tendon, but when a muscle contracts, it pulls on the bone. So it actually puts a force on the bone, especially if you can see in this picture, you add weights to it. So that pull is going to provide stress on your bone, which is going to trigger osteoblasts, and you're going to increase your bone density. You're going to get stronger bones. Gravitational stress is sometimes called compression stress. This is literally just the force of gravity on your body. It's the act of having to carry your own body around. So it's due to body weight. So if you gain weight, your bones have to get thicker and stronger because they have to support that weight. Another thing we know affects bone is your diet. So you really want to make sure that you're eating well. We know we have to have those calcium and phosphate salts because that's what actually contributes to bone density, right? 65% of bone's matrix are these salts. So we need to add them and make sure our bones are strong. We also need vitamins. We need vitamin D. Remember that synthesizes calcitriol. And we needed calcitriol so we could absorb calcium in the small intestine. So you might be eating it, but you need to absorb it in your small intestine as well. Vitamin C is critical to make collagen. So just think of the C in vitamin C for the C in collagen. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. You may have heard of stories of sailors having scurvy, and scurvy was due to a lack of vitamin C, a vitamin C deficiency. And so vitamin C, I've heard that they would take limes and lemons on voyages so they could make sure they had the vitamin C. Vitamin C, as we said, makes collagen, and collagen is abundant in your skin and your hair and your bones. You need vitamin A because it's been found to help stimulate osteoblasts, and you also need vitamin K and vitamin B12. There's not a whole lot of space there to write B12, but you need both of these because these are critical for your body, for your cells to make protein, and collagen is protein. So we're going to come back now and look again at blood calcium levels and homeostasis and come back to PTH and calcitonin. So we know that bone is a reservoir. We're going to focus on calcium. 99% of your calcium in your body is in your bones. It's in your skeleton. And calcium is critical for several things. Number one, obviously we said it maintains bone density. You also need it for your nerves to function. So when a nerve is talking to another nerve, or a neuron is talking to a neuron, they release neurotransmitters at a synapse. And those neurotransmitters cannot be released unless calcium is present. We need calcium for blood clotting. Muscles do not contract without calcium. And this is all three muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So if you don't have calcium, your heart can't beat. So it's obviously critical for life, and we need to maintain homeostasis. So if we look at where we need our blood calcium levels to be, the two main hormones, and they are antagonistic hormones, are going to maintain blood calcium levels. So let's say blood calcium levels decrease. So you're not eating calcium in your diet and they fall. Well, we know we need negative feedback. So if they decrease, we need to bring them back up again. So these little parathyroid glands, they're on the back of the thyroid gland, as I mentioned, they're going to notice decreased calcium levels in your blood. They release PTH. PTH is going to go after osteoclasts, and it's going to bring it back up again. On the other hand, if we're looking at blood calcium levels going up, so you're eating a good diet, you're getting your calcium. When the blood calcium levels go up, we still need to bring them back down to homeostasis with negative feedback. In this case, the thyroid gland will release calcitonin. Calcitonin will cause bone deposition. It will put the calcium in your bones to bring it back down to normal. So specifically, you have a little chart to fill out. If we're looking at the stimulus, is if your blood calcium levels decrease. Remember, that can be life-threatening. We have to have calcium for our heart to contract, for our blood to clot. So anytime that happens, then PTH will be released, because the goal is if the blood calcium levels decrease, PTH is going to return it to homeostasis. PTH is going to increase, right? That's its effects on your calcium. It's going to bring it back up again. And it does it by targeting three organs. Number one, it goes after bone. It stimulates the osteoclasts, and the osteoclasts are doing bone resorption. They're going to break down and release that calcium, take it out of your bones. So yes, your bones get a little weaker, but if not, you're going to die. It also goes to your kidneys, and it tells your kidneys to hold on to calcium. What that means is there'll be less calcium in your urine, because the kidneys are giant filters, so they're going to try to hold on to calcium. And it's going to go after your small intestine. This is where we absorb nutrients from what we eat. So it's going to really increase as much of that as possible, so you absorb all the calcium possible from whatever you're eating. Now, the opposite effect is going to happen with calcitonin. So again, calcitonin is released when your blood levels go up. So the stimulus is an increase in blood calcium levels. So their effect on calcium is to bring it back down. Now, the way it lowers your blood calcium levels is to act on the same three areas of the body, except they have a different response. Number one, it's going to go after bones and stimulate osteoblasts. So that calcium will be deposited into your bones, making them bigger and stronger. Number two, it goes after the small intestine. And in the small intestine, it will do the opposite. It will decrease absorption of calcium, meaning less of it leaves your food and your intestine and goes in your blood. So you will absorb less. And number 3, it goes to your kidney. And what it does is it allows your kidneys to get rid of calcium in your urine. So you excrete more calcium in your urine. Now, one concern with this is if you have kidney stones or you're prone to them, you probably don't want to eat a really high calcium diet, because extra calcium will end up in your kidneys, and in these individuals it can actually crystallize, and that's how you form a kidney stone. So we're looking at just a quick summary of factors with bone remodeling. Remember, if you have increased bone deposition, your bones get stronger. And we talked about all the factors that would do that, either by increasing osteoblasts or slowing down osteoclasts. Now, when we have bone resorption, that's the opposite, remember. So that's decreased osteoblasts, increased osteoclasts. So you're breaking bone down faster than you're building it. And this is where we kind of don't want to be. We want to be making strong bones. So that concludes our lecture on bone remodeling and bone development and bone strength.